Welcome, everyone. On behalf of Clearinghouse Review's editorial team, I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our discussion of safeguarding the rights of vulnerable populations during modernization of electricity distribution. I'm Catherine Dorn-Schreiber, Staff Attorney Legal Editor at the Shriver Center. I'll be moderating the webinar today. We have nearly 200 people registered for today's webinar, so we've had a great turnout. Registrants are from more than 35 states in the District of Columbia, and they represent a broad range of organizations. We have mostly legal aid programs, but we also have national and state support centers, federal and state government agencies, local advocacy organizations, several universities, a few private attorneys, and some utilities and energy-related companies. So again, welcome everyone. Today we're going to focus on some of the consumer issues that relate to smart grid technology and smart meters, especially issues that might affect low-income, disabled, and elderly people. We hope that today's information helps advocates in representing their clients if any smart meter issues come up in their communities. We're fortunate to have with us today Julie Nephew, Senior Attorney at AARP Foundation Litigation in Washington, D.C. Julie is going to talk about smart grid issues and advocacy for about 35 minutes. Then Dan Lesser, Senior Attorney at the Shriver Center in Chicago, will give an update on climate change legislation and low-income people. In the last part of the hour, we'll save about 10 minutes for questions and answers. If you do have questions, please send them at any point during the webinar by using the question and answer function of the webinar software, which you should be able to see on the right side of your screen in the webinar tools window. Please keep your questions short so that we'll be able to read them to the presenters. Before I turn the program over to the presenters, I'd like to share some information about Clearinghouse Review for those of you who might not be familiar with it. The review was first published in 1967, so we're in our 44th year of publication at the Shriver Center. The journal is published 6 times a year, both in print and online. If you visit our website at povertylaw.org, you can read the tables of contents for journal issues back to 1990, and you can also do keyword searches. You can access all past Clearinghouse Review articles with a subscription, or you can purchase individual articles without a subscription. In October, we published a special issue of the review on climate change and a green economy, new advocacy opportunities. You can see the cover of that issue on your screen. One of the articles that we published in that issue was, "What is the Smart Grid and Why Should We Care?" co-authored by Julie Nephew, one of today's presenters. For their support of both the special issue and this webinar, we'd like to thank the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, the Libra Foundation, and the Francis Beadler Foundation. All of you will have access to Julie's article on a resource page that we set up for this webinar. The resource page will also have today's PowerPoint presentation, an audio recording of the webinar, and some other resources. The link is on your screen. You should be able to see the link on your screen, and we'll be sending you the link in a follow-up email after the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Julie Nephew, Senior Attorney at AARP Foundation Litigation in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much, Catherine. Before we get started, I want to let you know who I am. That's me, my contact information on the screen. I'm a Senior Attorney at AARP Foundation Litigation, but I am really just doing this on my own personal views. This is not AARP speaking, this is Julie Nephew speaking. And also you should know I'm primarily a legal services or low-income advocate. I used to be a legal services staff attorney in Northern Virginia. And I'm not really an energy wonk, so my perspective on this issue is more related to how to advocate for low-income people as opposed to how to be an energy wonk or a smart meter wonk or any of that stuff. So hopefully that will not, cause a problem for anybody, because I don't know all the things about energy, but I'll give you enough to do litigation and advocacy on behalf of low-income people. So let's do now our very first poll question and find out who is in the audience, because I know there's a lot of legal services folks, but we do also want to find out more about who the advocates are who are listening to this presentation. So would you run the poll, please? The question is, what type of industry do you work for? And the choices are legal services, other nonprofit organization, governmental agency, utility company or regulator, or some other industry. So if you wouldn't mind, please, answering the poll question, and then we'll be able to show you the results in just a few minutes. That would be great. I don't know, I guess when the poll answers are open, will they be shown, Catherine?
Yes, you'll be able to see the percentages. There you go. If you could just read the percentages.
They are not showing up on my screen, so maybe you can.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read them. Legal services, and that's either LSC funded or non-LSC funded, 51%. Other nonprofit organizations, 31%. Utility company or regulator, 8%. Other, 6%.
So that's a pretty good mix. I think that's great, and I think that means that the level of this presentation is going to be just about right. I have this as a sort of a beginner's presentation, but also geared toward people who know a little bit about legal services and low-income advocacy. So despite there being a lot of complicated distribution modernization questions, really what we're focusing on is advocacy and making sure that low-income people are not harmed. So I'll be introducing a little bit of the basic regulatory framework just to make sure everyone's got the essential background that they need, and we'll discuss the consumer protections that are at stake here. So why are we talking about this at all? It's because demand for greater amounts of electricity, climate change, and the depletion of oil and other non-renewables like coal are driving up the cost of the environmental impact of generating electricity. And that means that people are going to have to pay more money, and we're going to have greater and greater problems supplying electricity to the people who need it. The basic regulatory structure means that the feds can't mandate particular changes. We end up with only the states having jurisdiction and over regulation of the intrastate monopoly features of the utilities. The state can regulate whether or not the rates are set at a particular level, whether or not the pricing is done a particular way, and how much utilities can recover of the expenses that they make in new investments, new power plants. The feds can't mandate any of that. As a result of the utilities and the states having this monopoly regulatory relationship, we end up with what's called universal service. Monopolies, like the utilities are monopolies, and they have to provide service on a non-discriminatory basis, and they have to do it so that end-use customers pay regular, they have to serve everybody on reasonable terms, and they have to set just and reasonable rates. So these are basic principles that come out of actual common law. It's because of the way that they're regulated and because of the way that our federal system was set up that this is a state function and there's particular obligations. It's not just free-for-all out there with the utilities. They don't get to do just everything they want to do just because they own these services. Now, the federal role, as I said, the feds cannot mandate what the states do in terms of setting rates. They only can regulate the interstate things, the wholesale energy market. The federal role in promoting the smart grid then is limited to being a guidance or assistance, setting national standards, or providing grant money. And so that's exactly what they're doing. The feds are suggesting that we have a goal to implement a smart grid, and that's including installing smart meters in every home. So we're going to end up with, by 2030, they'd like to end up with 60 million smart meters in everybody's homes. And to put a little bit of a carrot in front of the utilities' noses. They provided $3.4 billion to develop and implement the smart grid when they did the stimulus funding in 2009. And if you look at the carrot was the money, the utilities followed that carrot, and on your screen you'll see that the Department of Energy provided grants to a lot of states to do a lot of different things. The stuff in light blue is advanced metering infrastructure. You'll see that a lot of states got a lot of money. They provide, there's actually over 100 projects have been funded. Some were for smart meters, some for other things, but you'll be able to look at where you're from and see whether the Department of Energy money is out there. Now, there's about $3.5 billion in federal funds in this, but it's going to cost closer to $50 billion to provide all this, and that money comes from investors and others who are going to have to pay for it. Well, some of the others who are going to have to pay for it are us. We are going to be paid for it through rates. So let's talk a little bit about how it all works. The smart grid, what is it? It's the technologically advanced transmission system to improve the efficiency of the electricity distribution, because a lot of power, a lot of electricity is lost as it goes along the lines. It kind of leaks out and disappears. So if we improve the efficiency of the electricity distribution system and we encourage conservation, which means people will be using less, then we could do that using this new technology, and we're going to do it with two-way communication over the internet. Now, there's a couple of parts to this system. The first part of it is the Advanced Distribution Automation, or ADA. It's a technologically advanced system to distribute the electricity over the grid with greater efficiency and reliability. So we use superconducting wires instead of old-fashioned wires that lose energy. The goals and benefits of this is that we can increase the efficiency, means reducing the financial and environmental impact of meeting the goals. When a utility has to have what they call peaker plants. If they're going to provide enough electricity during times of peak demand, they have to have a lot of excess capacity. And so when they generate electricity on a regular old mild spring day, they may have to use only about half of their generating capacity. But on a hot summer day when everybody's using their air conditioning, they have to kick in these peaker plants to provide the extra electricity. Well, these peaker plants end up using usually coal or natural gas that burns more expensive. It's not their primary distribution or generating system, and so it tends to be dirtier or more expensive to run these extra peaker plants. The goal here of this ADA system is to reduce how much of this peak we have to do and how much excess capacity. Another goal is that we can promote the remote detection and repair of outages. So if we can reset a switch instead of sending a guy out there to check what's wrong with the lines. We can also start using wind, solar, and hydro renewable energy sources that really don't have, they're not that reliable. If the wind's not blowing and you're not getting enough energy from a wind system, then you can switch to a different system and a different generating capacity area. But you can add these extra systems in because you have better control over your ability to route electricity. As I said, you can also postpone constructing new generating plants because you're meeting the increased demand by reducing the amount of lost electricity or by adding these other renewable sources. And there's folks who want to be able to add electric vehicles and a way for utilities to provide enough energy to power these electric vehicles into the grid. Now, this is an expensive proposition. As I said, we're talking about billions of dollars to do this, but in the end, people anticipate that it's going to save a huge amount of money. If you reduce usage by only 4%, you save $20 billion. If you reduce peak electricity demand, you can save more than $1.5 billion in capital costs for new power plants. If you avoid overheated transmission lines, you're going to save $150 billion annually that is lost when there are blackouts and harm that's caused by the blackouts. For example, businesses can't provide the services that they're supposed to provide when there's a blackout. One of the cost savings is projected to come from reducing labor costs because you've automated the system. And unfortunately, all of these cost savings really haven't been focused on by the states at this point. They're really not focused on it at all. In fact, although some of the money is going there, the kinds of things that people are really focusing on in the state and that we're going to talk about today is the advanced metering infrastructure. Now, the AMI, or Advanced Metering Infrastructure, is often referred to as smart meters. They provide real-time data over the Internet to enable people to monitor or control their electricity usage. So if you can see that, oh, gee, we've got too much electricity going out right now, maybe we could turn something off. Or maybe we can unplug something that's drawing energy even though it's turned off. We can reduce our usage. The goal here is to provide a platform. These AMI, this infrastructure, is going to provide a platform that allows us to be more aware as consumers of how much electricity we use at a particular time of the day. And we can be billed for the electricity at the time we're using it instead of a flat rate, so that we're aware when we use electricity at peak times, we are using more money, as opposed to if we run the dishwasher at midnight, we're using less expensive energy. A lot of consumers aren't aware of that, so one of the goals of this metering infrastructure is to make sure people are aware that the time of the day that they use their electricity makes a difference. That's going to save a lot of money, but hopefully also make the transmission easier and avoid some of these blackouts because people aren't cramming all their usage into set times of the day. Now, these smart meters don't actually save energy. That has to be done either remotely or automatically. They just tell you these smart meters are going to provide information to the utilities, to the people who are having them installed in their homes, and maybe to other people, how much energy you're using at any particular time. The goal here, as I said, is to provide you with a financial incentive to reduce your usage at peak demand. So they're going to switch over to what's called time of use pricing. The time of use pricing is if you use it during the daytime, it's going to cost you more than if you use it at nighttime. There's a lot of variations on time of use pricing, but the goal here is to make you pay more for the more expensive electricity so that you will use less electricity when it's expensive to produce it. Peak demand is the time that they're focusing on trying to get you to shift your usage from, because that's where it has the most environmental and financial impact on both the companies and the people. Now, these interests of people in smart grid are not identical. Everybody's all happy about, we'll have a cleaner environment and we'll have more renewables and that sort of thing. But in the end, this one guy, Jim Stodgel, actually had put it a way that I like to read it. He's like, the utilities don't really care how much power you use. They just want your demand not to be lumpy. And on the other hand, the people, the consumers, they just want our bills to be low. So if we want our bills to be low, but the utility doesn't really care if we use a lot of electricity because that's how they make their money, they just don't want our demand to be lumpy, then you start to get some differences in what is the agenda here. In addition to that, you have other agendas going on here. For example, a lot of folks are like, oh, it's going to create jobs, but that's not really true. Even though the $150 million was provided for training programs by the stimulus funds, that money is for pretty low-level training programs. It's not going to put people through 4-year degrees, getting engineering degrees so that they can get the high-tech smart grid jobs. They're going to get some money to do the temporary installations of the smart meters. And even those jobs will probably be done by the currently employed maintenance workers who ultimately will lose their jobs because of this automation. So even though there's some folks out there who think this is a job creation opportunity, really it's not. What we do find with the AMI, the Advanced Metering Infrastructure, or smart meters, is that it's going to be expensive and there's going to be a lot of hidden costs that what we hope is that people will expose those costs. The utilities have to pay, as I said, they're going to have to come up with the money that the feds didn't provide. They provided $3.4 billion, but it's going to cost $50 billion. Where does the rest of the money come from? That comes from the ratepayers. They have to seek through their regulator, whoever their regulator is, they have to ask, can we have more money? Can we shift the cost of installing smart meters to the consumers, either through a surcharge or higher rates in the end? And in many cases, they want to do that even before the smart meters are installed. The basic meters are going to be pretty expensive, from $600, or the costs are coming down a little because there's a lot more folks trying to provide them now. And if you add remote control features that let you or the company adjust your usage over, say you're over at work and you want to turn off your pool pump, you can do that. That's going to cost more money to add those features to those meters. You also have problems with some folks don't have broadband. A lot of folks have broadband, but a lot of folks don't. And the ones who don't have the broadband capabilities, they're going to have to figure out a way to provide it. And so for some people, that cost will not be included and will be a hidden extra cost for them. Also, we have the problem of paying for compatible appliances and devices. They're talking about having refrigerators that can be told to not make ice at a particular time of the day because it's peak, or remote control devices so you can start your washing machine at a particular time, or turn it off if it turns on during peak hours. All of the devices that can be controlled remotely are going to be marketed, and a lot of people will benefit from using them, but because those costs of having the compatible devices are not necessarily included in the smart meter proposals, they're going to be hidden costs to consumers. And so one of the things that we are urging people to do is to make sure that everybody understands what the hidden costs are, especially for low-income people. We don't want to see smart grid proposals that don't really reflect what it will cost people to use this service. We don't want to see people charged for the services before they're actually getting any of the benefits. So, if there's a surcharge for 3 years while people are waiting to have their smart meter, we think that's probably not very fair, and we're hoping folks will say, no, let's not do it this way. Let's find a better way to do it. We also think that it's possible for people to subsidize the cost of the meters or the cost of the devices or the appliances. If the goal really is to reduce the amount of electricity and to conserve energy, as opposed to just make sure it's not lumpy usage, then shouldn't we make sure that low-income people have access to these devices and energy-efficient appliances? So we also think that there's ways to make people's homes more energy efficient and to weatherize them or make sure they have access to ways to reduce usage that they wouldn't have without some sort of a program to make sure they're getting the benefits from this and not just extra expenses. So, for example, in Maryland, we had the advocates in Maryland were able to get rid of this idea of a surcharge and mandatory time of use rates by saying that, we think that it's going to cause higher costs for people without giving them any benefits. And the commission rejected the pricing scheme and found that the benefits to consumers were not substantiated. They didn't prove that people were going to have benefits, and they couldn't guarantee people were going to benefit, so they didn't want to allow them to start charging the surcharge or implementing mandatory time of use prices. So that was a huge win that pretty much, I saw one report on some blog somewhere that said, that the Maryland decision rocked the entire smart grid world, and it really did. Folks are, taking a lot more notice now, and, the Maryland example didn't come up on the top 10 states to watch list, but it's there now, so good job, Maryland. In Pennsylvania, the advocates were able to get them to agree to withdraw a smart metering plan that was going to cost $15 a month and had $100 million in unspecified in-home devices. These are charges for things like the monitors or whatever. They were able to say, no, not until you provide the services. They withdrew. In fact, they didn't even, they didn't have to get a ruling. They got the utility to not even propose it in the first place, and that's, of course, the best way to do this advocacy. Another concept we need to talk about is this concept of demand response potential, one of those fancy technical words. It just means if you shift your usage, how much usage can you shift? Can you shift enough to offset the cost of the smart meter? So if they're going to charge you $15 a month for the smart meter, will you save $15 if you start using your electricity at nighttime and get the lower rates? The question is important because if the utility is saying you're going to save $10 off of your electricity bill every month if you start washing your dishes at night instead of washing your dishes during the day, is that true for all people? Or is it overstated? Maybe you're really only going to save $5 off of your bill every month for saving it. So that's your demand response potential. How much can you spend or how much can you save by shifting your usage? Well, some people have the ability to save a whole lot more than others. People who are living in single-family homes that are larger and people who have central air conditioner can respond to a greater degree to these pricing signals than people who are living in multifamily units or smaller units or units without central air conditioning. And that's because they simply have more usage that they can cut out in the first place. So one of the things that you're going to have to figure out is whether or not the utilities are in fact telling you the right amount of the demand response potential. Now, the direct load control alternatives is important because they're saying you might have the ability to reduce your usage and to increase your demand response potential by having a smart meter that tells you this is how much electricity you're using, but there are alternatives. The utility itself could say shut off your electricity or your air conditioning or your pool pump or whatever without a smart meter. They can already automatically do that. And that's called direct load controls. Those alternatives are alternatives that they provide incentives. You are paid by the utility company, say $100, to allow them to control when your air conditioning runs and to turn it off during peak demand. And usually you would have the right to override the utility's control, but they would have the ability to control it when you're not around and not using it. That's another kind of alternative. And the reason that's important is because the cost of the meters may have a disproportionate burden on some people, whereas some of those other direct load controls may be less burdensome on some folks. And so what we want advocates to do is to consider how do the regulators think about these various kinds of alternatives? Did they think about them, or are they just on this smart meter train that can't be stopped? The goal here is just to say, look, what else is out there? Is there a better way to do it? Now, some people think, okay, $15 a month, no big deal. I can pay $15 a month, and it's for a good cause. I'm going to have a better environment and better air quality and all that stuff. And the prices of electricity are going to go up anyway, so we may as well do what we can to reduce usage now. That's all well and good, but for some people, this disproportionate burden sort of flies in the face of this concept of universal service that we talked about. Some people cannot afford to pay this extra expense, and especially people who are on life-sustaining equipment, say oxygen equipment, or who are older or have disabilities or care for old and young people. They need to be able to access these utilities even though this costs are going up. So the question is, are the rates reasonable and just for them, not just for people who can afford to pay the extra $15? The low-income folks tend to be more vulnerable, and there's a lot of reasons that they're more vulnerable to these price increases. First of all, they often have nothing to turn off. They don't have a clothes dryer. They don't have a dishwasher. They may not have air conditioning at all, or if they do have it, they use it less frequently. They may have inelastic demand. Folks who are home during the day, taking care of sick people, have an oxygen machine or anything like that that they have to run, can't shift their demand to off-peak hours. The folks who have these inelastic demands, because they can't shift, will not be able to save the money on their energy bills. They don't have the same potential for demand response that folks who can turn those things off have. So one question we have is how are people impacted by this? Do they have a problem where they're going to have higher bills because they can't shift their demand? Another problem, of course, is that they won't be able to afford new refrigerators and energy efficiency and things like that. And they're going to have to more carefully monitor their usage. So if they know that they've got $100 budgeted for electricity one month and they have to be very careful of how much they use, they have to actually look at it. They can't just rely on some automated feature on their iPhone applications to figure out whether or not they're using too much electricity. It's going to be a whole different experience for them. They also have a problem with, as we said earlier, broadband. The digital divide is out there. They don't have the same internet technology. They don't necessarily have a laptop computer that they can monitor their usage by. They might have to have an in-home device, and then they could only use it when they're home. They won't be able to necessarily get these direct load features that other folks could use to help them conserve. So what we want advocates to do is to force utilities to provide better data so that we have a better understanding of how low-income people will react to these pricing signals. Are their demand potential estimates accurate for this population? There's a little bit of information out there, but it's very inconclusive. We need to make sure that when we are talking to the regulators, that the regulators understand that some of the information they have in their pricing scheme may be overstated. They may be saying that people can save a lot more money than they actually do. This is an area where, the legal advocacy is one thing and the technology wonk is another. You need experts to be able to show that this is the kind of information that they don't have an accurate hold on, and they need more information on it. And there have been some efforts to get more information. The Department of Energy is going to be studying how lower income people and other people in different pricing designs. So as I said at the beginning, there's several kinds of time of use pricing. You can provide this direct load, or you can give people make them pay more on critical peak days, or you can have them charged more if they have a particular usage during a particular time of the day. There's all these different ways to do it. Department of Energy is going to be looking at that, and they're going to be issuing reports, but not till late 2013. That's pretty far away when the smart meter proposals are going in now. So we need to encourage regulators to maybe slow down until we know better how things are going. And we also need to suggest that there are alternatives, and regulators should consider those alternatives. Is it less expensive to do the direct load? Is it less expensive to use the smart meter? What are the benefits of each? What if they what if they did it with weatherization programs? What if they did it with access to appliances or other kinds of applications that can make sure people are benefiting to the same extent across different socioeconomic groups? In California, they were able to get some data information, and they have the disconnection data that the utilities are supposed to report every month. That's very good. And they've also got extra protections. If there's too many disconnections, then they'll have extra protections. In Maryland, the regulator said, look, we don't know whether or not the BG&E's predictions of usage are accurate, so we're not going to make it up for them. We're going to put them to their proof. We don't want people to have to pay the price of them being wrong. So those are good examples of how the failure of the data are really important, and advocates need to push that. Now, one of the questions that folks may ask is, whether people should get excited about the extra $15 a month or whatever the price is going to be for these extra meters. And the answer is that for a lot of low-income people, these utilities are already too expensive, and the reasons that they're too expensive are out of their control. They have older, less efficient appliances that they can't do anything about. Energy costs have been going up, and they're consuming a huge proportion of their income compared to higher income families. And so, yes, that $15 matters to this group of folks. And that's not just, they don't have enough money. It's not just that they don't have lights at night. What ends up happening is that people end up with fires and problems with air quality because they're using systems to heat or light their homes that are risky. And with so many people, record numbers of people living in poverty, 14.3% this year, with that many people living in poverty, we're talking about a risk to public health and safety. It's beyond the individual level. And we also know that low-income population tends to have more cardiovascular, respiratory, diabetes, stroke, and those kinds of problems. And those are the very problems, health problems, that are worsened by temperature-related conditions. So the very young, the very old, and the people with those conditions, or if they're taking certain medical medications, they have difficulty maintaining their normal body temperature. If you have risk of cardiac disease, and it's bad for you to be underheated or cooled during the summer. And if you have a lower socioeconomic status, you are automatically at risk of these temperature-related deaths. And that's a real problem. That's the only kind of thing that we know is consistent across the states, is that lower socioeconomic status makes a difference in terms of heating and cooling temperature-related risks. We also know people are hungry. They're forced to heat or eat. In the northern states, you see folks being hungry in the late winter, and in the southern states in the late summer, because they can't afford the utilities at the time that they need the electricity. And these can have lifelong consequences, because people who are hungry and have food insecurity have developmental delays. That causes a greater stress on public health and safety. So what can advocates do? They can team with health professionals and others to get the word out about the problems, the societal costs of setting unaffordable utility rates. And I would add, not just health professionals, but, educate the media. Make sure that they understand this. Find somebody who's going to write articles and say, gee, this is really important, not just to the 10 people who can't afford it. We have to make sure that we are maintaining our assistance programs, because electricity rates are going up, and that's not going to stop. We have to simplify our subsidy programs. A lot of people cannot access them. That happened in, we have folks in California who have reduced the disconnection rates, and who are trying to make sure that when a utility looking at smart meters and that stuff, that they understand the health and safety risks. Massachusetts, folks in Massachusetts were able to get a utility to obtain the data needed to show that this low-income usage, or the impact that dynamic pricing have on the low-income families, that it's available and people understand it. In Nevada, they opened a docket specifically to look at the importance of these shutoff protections, and to, even though it improved the smart grid project, it said you have to find out more about how it's impacting the low-income people. The utility was claiming they couldn't figure it out. They didn't know how to reach the low-income people or study the low-income people, and so the utility actually ordered them to hire an expert. So that's pretty cool stuff that the folks in Nevada did. In New York, they were able to reduce, they said you cannot require time of use pricing. You have to make that voluntary. In Maine, they went from a mandatory system in the 1980s, and they ended up with a voluntary system because people were upset about it. Another feature of smart meters that is important to understand is prepaid meters or service limiters. Smart meters can be used as a prepayment service instead of as a credit-based service, and they can also be shut down if too much electricity is used. This is less cost-effective. It costs more to have a prepaid system because you have to have a kiosk and a smart card, and you have to figure out how to make sure it's loaded. So the electricity is more expensive if you're using a smart meter or the prepaid meters for this service. And you can also have a problem because you can disconnect people without providing all the notice and other procedural protections designed to prevent disconnection. The utilities like it because they get to collect their money, but you know, that's really, they have to do it in accordance with the particular kinds of procedural protections that are already out there. They also can do it without the consumer contact that is often required by the state, and you know, it's less expensive to disconnect people remotely because you don't have to send a person, but you know, that's not what the law in some states have, and it's also not good for people. It can have tragic consequences. If they shut people off without sending someone to the home, maybe they're missing the last opportunity they have to avoid the shutoff. For example, you know, in Michigan, a 93-year-old man died. Even though the money was sitting on the table, his service limiter shut off. And of course, there have been numerous fires and people killed when, you know, they've been found, they were started by candles in a home that didn't have electricity. So we want people to encourage that mandatory prepay programs be banned, and that service limiting meters, especially for renters and customers who have outstanding debts, should be prohibited. And we want to ensure that when there is a disconnection or when there is a service smart meter installed, that we don't circumvent the notice requirements. We also want to ban these remote disconnections so that people have the opportunity to get a payment plan or make sure that they understand what are their options. Is there a service program that can help them pay for their electricity? Some examples of that were in Massachusetts, where they encouraged them to no prepaid meters because they violate the shutoff rules. In Maryland, they said they need to make sure that people comply with the regular rules right now. In Ohio, they negotiated settlements to avoid prepayment. And in California, they actually require the utilities to provide notice to people that they can get a payment plan if they can't pay for it. And they have to provide it in languages and accessible formats if folks can't, so they don't just get it in English and they don't know that service is provided for them. In New York, they said you cannot remote disconnect because that violates the state law. In Kentucky, they were able to defeat prepayment programs. So there's lots of examples out there. You can also add age and disability-related protections, and to make sure that you can maybe make sure that if there is a prepayment, that they can't shut it down when say it's the middle of the night and they can't go get the thing recharged. You can't shut it down then. In California, they have lifeline support or medical baseline programs, and they have to send out a field representative who can collect the money from the person before it's shut off. In Nevada, they have to have people who are visiting the elderly and disabled customer before they shut it off, and they can reduce the reconnection time frames. In Massachusetts, their general law has a very good disconnect rule where you can't terminate service for anyone, whether or not there's a smart meter involved, if there's very young or very old people, and it's cold weather. There's a lot of states that have cold weather requirements, but not necessarily for young and old people. So another problem with these investments in smart meters is that we don't really have any sense of what's going to be the final standard. The feds haven't set the standards for these things, and we don't know how much is it going to cost to upgrade meters that are installed today that don't meet the new standards. So we end up with maybe some stranded costs. Stranded cost is one of those technical terms that says, you know, if you abandon a system that you already have installed before its use is completely paid for, then it's still being paid for in the rates even though you're not using it anymore. That's a big deal. $93 million in Texas for obsolete meters and $686 million for meters with the new technology. And in California, people had to pay almost $1 billion to upgrade smart meters that were already installed because they didn't have all the bells and whistles that they needed. In Maryland, they were able to show that there were some $250 million in stranded costs that didn't get included, and so that was part of the Commission's rejection. Is that, you know, we already have meters out there. Let's use them until we don't need them anymore. The Illinois system said you can't increase the rates just to pay for smart meters. That violates their state law saying you can't have a single issue rate setting. And that means that some customers may be getting a huge rebate. Unfortunately, that's been appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. Stay tuned on that one. Another problem is that utility complaints, consumer complaints go to the regulators. They don't go to the regular courts. So there's going to be some questions about unfair deceptive acts and practices, and we're going to have some privacy and security concerns where we'll have an awful lot of data out there that we don't know how to protect. So we need to help make sure that people, Google and Microsoft, are not using that in the wrong way. And so the question is, these are legitimate concerns. Who's going to take care of folks? Hopefully you guys, legal services advocates, will be there at the table doing that. So here's me, and I'm going to send you back to Catherine so Dan has a chance to talk.
Thank you, Julie. We appreciate your highlighting some of the consumer issues that advocates might want to watch for, and especially for sharing some of the advocacy successes that have happened so far. Before we go to Dan, someone did ask a question about whether the slides will be available. So yes, Julie's PowerPoint will be available on the resource website that we've set up, and Julie does have footnotes with citations in her presentation that I don't think you could see on the screen, but they are on the slides. So when you access the hard copy, you'll be able to see what the citations were. So thanks again, Julie. Now I'd like to introduce our second presenter, Dan Lesser, Senior Attorney at the Shriver Center, and he'll talk about climate change legislation and low-income people.
Thanks, Catherine. My topic today is the status of efforts to ameliorate the financial impact on low-income people of policies that address climate change by limiting carbon emissions. First, though, I want to note that there are a number of ways, separate and apart from financial considerations, in which climate change disproportionately impacts low-income people and communities. These include, 1, poor neighborhoods tend to be heat islands with more heat-trapping surfaces like hot asphalt and less tree cover. 2, low-income people are less likely to have air conditioning or transportation to cooling centers. 3, there is more pollution in poor neighborhoods. This was transformed by hot temperatures into harmful ambient ozone that aggravates respiratory conditions such as asthma. And 4, as we have seen, poor neighborhoods are much more vulnerable to the effects of natural disasters than other neighborhoods, and these will be more frequent as a result of climate change. Getting back then to the financial issues, any policy that limits carbon emissions will increase the cost not only of power, but also a wide range of energy-intensive consumer goods as businesses pass on higher production costs to consumers. Low-income people can least afford these higher costs, and they are the least able to make the capital investments needed to lower their energy consumption. The major legislative initiatives to address climate change by limiting carbon emissions acknowledge and account for this. The major legislative initiatives are the American Clean Energy and Security Act of 2009, H.R. 2454, which was passed by the U.S. House of Representatives in June 2009, and the Kerry-Lieberman American Power Act, released in draft form in May 2010. Both include important provisions that would prevent measures that limit carbon emissions from increasing hardship on poor families. Both bills employ cap-and-trade policy to limit carbon emissions. Under cap-and-trade, an overall limit on carbon emissions is set, and companies buy and sell permits to pollute, known as allowances. The overall level of carbon emitted is gradually lowered by increasing the cost of allowances. As I stated before, taxing carbon emissions through cap-and-trade or in any other way will increase costs to consumers. The House-passed bill protects low-income people by allocating 15% of the proceeds from selling emissions allowances to low-income consumer relief. This is about the amount that cap-and-trade is projected to increase consumer costs. Households with income below 150% of the federal poverty level would be eligible for the full benefit, and the amount of the benefit would be based on the Department of Energy's annual calculation of the energy costs for an average household. The bill also creates a delivery system that will maximize the utilization of the benefit, including automatic enrollment for food stamps and SSI recipients, and delivery of a monthly benefit on the same debit cards that other benefits are delivered on. It also would increase the earned income tax credit for childless workers, which is the population of low-income people least likely to have EBT cards. The Kerry-Lieberman draft bill in the U.S. Senate is essentially the same as the House-passed bill with respect to diverting 15% of the proceeds from the sale of emissions allowances to low-income consumer relief and making households with income below 150% of the federal poverty line eligible for the monthly benefit delivered on a debit card in an amount determined by the Department of Energy's annual calculation. However, with passage of health care reform, in the future, childless workers will be enrolled through their participation in Medicaid, so increasing the earned income tax credit for childless workers will not be necessary for them to access the benefit. Therefore, Kerry-Lieberman instead provides a tax refund for moderate income families with income between 150 and 250% of the federal poverty line that will partially defray their higher energy costs. Now, unfortunately, the prospects for cap-and-trade legislation in the new Congress are not good, and that's probably an understatement. The House bill I've described passed in the current Congress by a very narrow margin, 219 to 212, with 44 Democrats voting no and 8 Republicans voting yes. The Senate bill was originally going to be co-sponsored by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, but he dropped out shortly before the draft was released. So let me move on to regulation. While legislative prospects, as I've said, are not too good, the regulation of carbon emissions by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency is proceeding. Indeed, on January 2nd, carbon emissions from U.S. industrial sources will be regulated for the first time. The regulations apply to large new projects and plant upgrades. Other carbon emitters will be regulated later. Earlier in the Obama administration, the EPA declared emissions of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, to be a danger to human health, which is the legal prerequisite to regulating them. States were recently given guidance and considerable discretion on what sorts of technologies they could require businesses to use to limit such emissions. There is an effort in Congress to block the EPA from regulating carbon emissions in this way. It is estimated that there are 56 votes in the Senate to block EPA regulations, and there are several moderate Democratic senators up for re-election in 2012 who may be inclined to also vote to block EPA regulation. However, it would require 67 votes to override a presidential veto. It is also important to recognize that there would be no consumer relief available through the regulatory process. And I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thanks for the update, Dan. I also wanted to mention that there's a couple of items on the resource page that we've set up, and they're by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities relating to climate change legislation and low-income people, in case you'd like more information on that topic. So thanks again, Dan.
Sure.
Okay, now we're going to give the presenters a chance to answer some questions. Remember, you can submit short questions by using the question and answer function of the webinar software. Feel free to submit questions both for Julie on smart grid topics and Dan on climate change legislation. So first to Julie, We have advocates from both LSC-funded and non-LSC-funded organizations on the webinar today. Are you aware of any restrictions on LSC-funded programs on getting involved in advocacy surrounding smart meters?
As far as I know, there are no restrictions on working this. As long as you have a client, you're entitled to work on these issues. Of course, you're going to have problems with, what are your priorities? My view on it is that if you're not at the table when these decisions are made, you're going to see a lot of people on the back end who are getting disconnected and who you won't really have the tools to help. So my view is get there now before the harm is done.
Okay, thank you. Deanne, we have a question that came in for you. Should advocates just give up on federal legislation and focus on state-by-state and region-by-region efforts using California as the model?
I would say that the prospects for federal legislation on climate change through cap-and-trade policies are pretty dim, as I described. So, unless I guess I would monitor with advocacy groups in D.C. and see whether what opportunities they might see. There might be, perhaps there's some lesser things that could be done. So I would just kind of keep an eye on that. But as far as the big cap and trade legislation, it doesn't look good for that.
Okay, thanks. We have a question came in for Julie. An advocate wrote in from Montana, and she said she has no idea what's going on there regarding smart grids. Where do they start? Who do they contact? That sort of thing.
Well, your regulator, your state regulator, whoever regulates your utility, should be able to tell you whether or not there's any rate-making proposals that have been filed with the state. You can also look on the Department of Energy website to see whether or not any of the federal money has gone to any of the states. Pretty much there's going to be something going on. If it's not going on this year, it's going to be going on soon. So you should try to look up those things. Now, the other thing you could do is contact me offline through my contact information, and I'll put you in touch with AARP has got some advocates on the ground who regularly work on these issues and who do advocacy and know everything that is going on in the states, and I can put you in touch with those folks.
And other than AARP resources, Julie, do you have some other resources you might want to recommend for advocates?
Absolutely, and these are also listed on the resource page, but the NCLC, National Consumer Law Center, has got a listserv that deals with these issues, and they've got some publications. They've got Energy, Utility, and Communication Consumer Protection publication and a Climate Change Justice publication. They've also got, we've got some links to various kinds of partners who do this in Ohio or in California. There's a lot of groups out there who are working on this, and some of those links are located on the resource page. But the National Consumer Law Center's Energy Listserv is a great tool, and you can sign up and get, find out what's going on around the country or locally and find out who is doing stuff. If you can't get in touch with the NCLC folks, contact me and I'll try to submit a question for you to the listserv.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And someone's asking about the resource page. We will put up the link, and also you'll receive it in a follow-up email after the webinar. Julie, we had another question come in. I'm not sure what state this is from, but why does the environmental community ignore many issues of cost impact on low-income consumers? How do we open a dialogue with them about environmental justice?
Well, the environmental part of this is a pretty common rub between the low-income community and the environmental community, this cost question. They don't care about the cost. They care about the damage to the environment, and that's just their main goal, is to prevent this harm to the environment. I do think the groups need to work together, and the sooner we can all come to the table, the better. I mean, as I said, these smart meters are going to cost a lot of money, but all by themselves, they don't conserve electricity. How can we get them to help us save money and still protect the environment? What can be done? Well, one thing that can be done is providing these more energy efficient appliances to low-income people. That serves their goals and our goals. So there's a lot of examples out there, and there is a very big, as the questioner noted, there's a very big gulf between the two groups, and I think that folks do need to start talking to each other more on these issues.
Thank you, Julie. We're actually coming to the end of our hour or so. We're going to need to wrap up. I wanted to mention that after the webinar, you should see on your screen a link to a short survey. We hope that you'll take a few minutes to fill it out to help the Clearinghouse Review editorial team plan future webinars. We are planning to continue in 2011 our coverage of climate change and implications for poor people and possible solutions. So if you have any suggestions, especially for successful advocacy stories on climate change or other green issues, please let us know either through the follow-up survey that you'll receive or by email. And the address you can use is clearinghousereview@povertylaw.org. Again, that's clearinghouse-review, all one word, @povertylaw.org. As I mentioned, we'll be sending you a follow-up email. That will have the link to the resource page. It will have today's webinar, an audio archive. It'll have Julie's presentation, including the citations. It'll have Julie's Smart Grid article that was in Clearinghouse Review. It will have several of the regulatory orders that Julie talked about in her presentation, as well as several other resources that you might find useful. On behalf of the editorial team of the Shriver Center, thank you to everyone for joining us today, and special thanks to our presenters, Julie and Dan, for graciously taking the time to share some important information that hopefully will be helpful in advocates' work. Goodbye.